The nation of Japan was one of the last areas of Asia to be influenced by European imperialism. The events of imperialism in Japan had a significantly different impact upon the people living there than some of the other events we have seen in India, China, and Africa. The different impact of imperialism in Japan is largely a result of the decisions made by the people of Japan and the country's history and geography. What resulted was the nation of Japan opening itself up to the influence of European nations and a modernizing of Japanese culture that occurred very quickly and turned them into a major world power in the relatively short period from 1850 to 1914. Due to its geography and the fact that Japan is an island off the coast of mainland Asia, Japan had remained fairly isolated from major world events that we have looked at earlier this year. Japan had conflicts with Korea, China, and Russia, its immediate neighbors, in the eastern part of mainland Asia, but had remained relatively isolated from the rest of the world and the events that were occurring. As a result, Japan was in a state of isolation from 1500 to 1800. Very little of what was going on in the outside world beyond Japan's borders had an influence within the country of Japan, and Japanese citizens were largely left out of the changing and developing world. This was a result of the rule that was put in place by a group known as the Tokugawa shogun. This group of feudal landlords and warriors controlled Japan and ruled under very strict conditions. Japanese citizens were not allowed to trade with the outside world and were not allowed to bring in many of the goods and technology that had been discovered by Europeans and that had been traveling throughout the world as a result of European exploration. Due to this factor, Japan's culture was significantly different from that of much of the rest of the world. Under the Tokugawa shogun, during the period from 1500 to 1800, you were divided into one of four groups within Japanese society. At the top of Japanese society was the shogun, the wealthy and powerful landlords who were essentially military dictators. These warriors ruled over their land and controlled the lives of Japanese citizens and the direction of Japanese society and culture. Beneath the shogun were a group known as the daimyo. These were highly respected warriors, or otherwise known as samurai. In addition to the daimyo, there was a group known as the lesser samurai. These two groups were similar in that both were largely rural farmers who lived and farmed the land of Japan, working for the landlord that controlled that region. When it was time for a war to occur or any kind of incident, the lesser samurai and the daimyo were expected to leave their traditional way of life and go fight for their landlord and their country. This is what earned them a high level of respect in Japanese society and gave them a special privilege and status. Anyone who was not in the shogun, daimyo, or lesser samurai category fell into the last group of Japanese society, which was merchants and peasants. These people had very little power and very little control over what went on within Japan's government and Japan's society. This social structure would be uprooted and changed as a result of imperialism and the entrance of European and Western culture into Japan's society. During the period of the mid-1800s, Japan began on a process of opening itself up to the outside world. This happened because foreign nations, which had become more powerful than Japan, were putting pressure on Japan to open it up to trade with Europeans and other countries. In addition, There was internal pressure from the daimyo and the samurai, who were losing some of their privileged status and respect within Japanese culture as these changes began to occur. Finally, because of its isolation and its near 300-year history of not interacting with the outside world, Japan was significantly behind the countries of Europe in terms of their technology and their ability to wage war. This left Japan in a very vulnerable situation where they could not actually defend themselves from invasion by the more powerful and more technologically advanced European countries. When these three factors came together, they pushed Japan and the Japanese people to want to open themselves up and engage with the rest of the world. Despite this internal desire to open up and modernize, it took the pressure from an outside force to actually accomplish it. In the mid 1850s, the United States, through its representative, Commodore Matthew Perry, took a letter to the Japanese government demanding Japan open itself up to trade with the United States. This letter and decision from President Franklin Pierce started the process of Japan opening itself up and gave the United States an important role in both Japanese history and its development. When Commodore Perry arrived, he was able to convince the leaders of Japan to sign a treaty known as the Treaty of Kanagawa. This treaty gave the United States exclusive trading rights and most favored nation status within Japan, meaning the United States would get to make many decisions about Japanese trade and have a significant impact on the technology and culture coming into Japan from the outside world. Once this treaty was signed, Japan went through a series of changes within its country. The first of these changes was a change to the government of Japan, in which the daimyo and the samurai worked to overthrow the shogun and restore the 15-year-old emperor, Emperor Mutsuhito, to power. Mutsuhito became the ruler of Japan because he would have been the rightful successor had the Tokugawa shogun not taken over Japan in the 1500s. If you had followed the traditional familial line through history, Mutsuhito would have become the emperor upon his birth. Mutsuhito, after taking over in 1867, would rule Japan until 1912, leading it through one of the most important periods in its history, a period known as the Meiji Restoration. During this time, he ruled Japan with the goal of establishing Japan as a rich country with a strong military. In order to do this, Mutsuhito looked to the outside world and took many actions to benefit the country of Japan based on what had benefited the powerful nations of Europe and the United States. Mutsuhito looked to these nations to strengthen the Japanese military, technology, and economy. Once he was able to undertake these efforts and achieve success in these areas, he was able to influence the rest of Japanese culture to adapt itself to Western ideas and technology by showing the people the benefits of technology such as the telephone or the telegraph, by having modern weapons. He was able to convince the Japanese people that these changes were necessary in order to protect the country from Western nations who might invade them. In all, these changes left Japan in a situation where they were able to develop fairly quickly and become a world power who would have an influence in both World War I and World War II.